the connection between church mission and the notion of social justice probably seems obvious to most of us in this room. I suspect you wouldn't be here if that connection didn't play some role in your lives. Nevertheless, certain recent events remind us of the need for presentations like this, where the connection is made. And I'm thinking here of the fact that the publicity for this talk included the phrase, recent challenges to the notion of social justice. If you've been paying attention to the news the last 2 weeks, you heard one recent challenge, perhaps a very strong one. Just 2 weeks ago, commentator Glenn Beck challenged the phrase social justice. And I'll give you 3 quotes from what I could discern of his talk. I don't really watch much TV, and I don't think I could actually pick Glenn Beck out of a police lineup. I'm hoping that I'll never have to do that, by the way. I hope I won't. One phrase he uttered, as far as I could tell, was that any church that employs the phrase social justice should be shunned. If you hear your pastor or bishop use the phrase social justice or economic justice, run the other way and look for another church. And finally, he said, economic justice and social justice are merely code words for communism and Nazism. These are claims of Glenn Beck. These comments do remind us that we're treading on contested terrain when we talk about social justice. It opens up and reminds us of a recurring debate that's been going on for decades, or really centuries, regarding the politics of faith, the overlap, the intersection between our faith lives and our lives in society. That includes political and economic as well. So here are some of the questions that arise. Does Christian faith really require the pursuit of social justice? Is it even wise to draw connections between faith and justice? And what are the dangers of drawing those connections too tightly? Those are reasonable questions, and I hope that by the end of this 40 minutes or so of my talk and the question and answer session to follow, that we'll have a sense of some of the answers to those questions. Now, as soon as Glenn Beck finished his statement, it was just about 2 weeks ago, covered in all the major media, progressives jumped into the fray, and they wanted to give the other side of the story. An acquaintance of mine, we've appeared on several panels together in recent years, is Jim Wallace, an evangelical author and preacher of Sojourners magazine fame. He weighed in immediately by reminding the media, whoever would listen, that Jesus' Sermon on the Mount contained a lot of things that appear to be more or less what we use today, what we call today, social justice. You'll remember Jim Wallace from his books, and the titles give away his message, God's Politics, The Soul of Politics, and his earlier volume with a more telling name, The Call to Conversion, Why Faith is Always Personal but Never Private. In all of his writings and his teachings, and whenever I've run into him, Jim Wallace wants to portray the prophetic side of Jesus. And he gives the image of Jesus, which I think is consistent with the Gospels as we read them, of a campaigner against poverty, a prophet standing up for the poor. Jim Wallace is eager to challenge those who would claim that Jesus called us merely to practice charity and not to get involved with the dirty work of justice. It's outside of the realm of those who would follow Jesus. No, Jim Wallace says, and I think I would join him, and I know that our Catholic Church documents would join him, that we are called as Christians precisely to engage in social reform and to work to advocate for changes that will help the poor. Some might read certain gospel passages as supporting a rather thorough separation of faith and public life. And so all the synoptic gospels have that passage in which Jesus gives the punchline, render unto Caesar the things that belong to Caesar, and render unto God things that belong to God, seeming to separate them out, or so a proof texting of that verse might suggest. Or more pointedly, in John 18:36, Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. A phrase that's more ambiguous, actually, in meaning than it appears in that text. So, do we Christians have a mission to address justice issues? That's the focus of my talk. I'm going to be citing church documents. I'm going to be citing recent events. I'm going to be citing flows of theological debates over the years. And the question is there a faith-justice connection that goes beyond merely charity, which we know flows from our faith? The question is, does social justice flow from our faith? Now, I've heard enough stories about the rabbinic, the Jewish tradition, to have run several times into this this situation where somebody poses a question to a kind of a long-winded rabbi who's famous for giving long speeches. And by the way, if I was a rabbi, I would fit in that category. I give long discourses. And I've heard several of these occasions. The rabbi was challenged to answer the question directly, and if necessary, while standing on one foot only, which an average person can only do for a minute or two. So here, when I'm asked to describe the Catholic social teaching tradition, so the last 120 years or so of Catholic teaching, what I usually asked to summarize that history, which is hard to do, even on one foot. Here's my sentence. I simply say this when asked that question. I say, the Catholic Church in recent decades has moved from a charity alone orientation to a charity and justice orientation. We've moved from a sole focus on charity to a focus that balances works of charity and works of social justice. And if you want to tell a long story about how we got here, both before and after the groundbreaking encyclical of 1891 from Pope Leo XIII, it was called Rerum Novarum, on the condition of labor. To tell a long story, you'd have to dredge up the Dickensian conditions that faced workers in the 19th century that led the church to enter the fray and to argue not just for more generosity to these hard-pressed industrial workers, this new world of industrial work, but also to change the structures that caused their poverty in the first place. So I'll be talking a little bit more about that response, but that's my standing on one foot answer. We've moved from charity alone to a charity plus justice orientation, and that shift, that change, was necessitated by new social relations, the rise of industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, the way that workers were treated by large firms, the captains of industry, so-called the robber barons, and their need for wages, their need to make a living wage. Okay? So what I'm going to do in the remainder of the talk is to introduce some fairly sharp distinctions between charity and justice, but then I'm going to soften the distinctions after that. So if you get uncomfortable about 1/3 of the way through the talk, don't worry, because I'm going to soften the distinctions after I introduce them. Okay, this is an old technique. We've been using this for centuries. Every Jesuit is trained to do this. Some of my friends skip that day of formation, and they don't know how to do this, but I work on them. I'd just like to start by ticking off some of the qualities of charity and some of the qualities of justice as we conventionally use these terms, okay? So what is charity? Typically, charity emphasizes works for direct service of people in need. If you're of a certain age, and I certainly am, you remember the phrase, the corporal works of mercy, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, housing those who are homeless. That's the idea of charity. Sometimes it can be described as a handout, giving something to somebody in need, direct, immediate, on the spot, response to need. On the other hand, justice is although not unconcerned about immediate needs, when we invoke the term social justice, we think more, our imaginations run towards working for structural change in society. Very often it takes the form of political advocacy, trying to lobby members of Congress, for example, or trying to write letters to the editor, trying to make known perhaps to the captains of industry or stockholders some need that's not being addressed. And the ideal stance is not a handout, but with social justice, it emphasizes a hand up. Let's lift the poor. Let's change the structures that hold them down. When we talk about charity, we're talking about voluntary work and occasional work. You've heard the phrase, practice random acts of kindness. That's the charity end of the spectrum. And on the justice end of the spectrum is more of a sense of duty or obligation with regular, even methodical efforts over the long term, over a long period of time, to improve the situation and perhaps to prevent poverty in the first place. On the negative side, sometimes people who work exclusively on the charity end of the spectrum are accused of merely offering Band-Aid solutions or practicing hit-and-run ministry. Whereas on the justice side, there's a sense of methodical efforts, never resting, never taking a day off, and rather than Band-Aids, the analogy is we need to perform corrective surgery in society, deep, thoroughgoing efforts to really change the way things are going if we are ever to have social justice. Okay? So I think we've gotten a sense of it. Sometimes you see bumper stickers that capture some of these distinctions, like give a person a fish, feed that person for a day, but teach a person to fish, more of a social justice long-term approach. Teach a person to fish, feed that person for a lifetime. There's, again, the distinction between long and short run, between charity and justice. It really boils down to a compassionate approach under charity that addresses at least the surface realities and the symptoms of the problems, but then social justice attempts to add to that, addressing deep structures and addressing deeper social causes of the problems in society. One of my favorite commentators on the justice-charity distinction is well known to all of you, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one of the greatest public preachers and I would say public theologians that this country has ever produced. Martin Luther King spent a lot of time talking to various audiences over time about the story of the Good Samaritan, which we find in Luke chapter 10. When he addressed that topic, he sometimes talked about the difference between a hand up and a handout. Actually, that's where I got the phrase. I'm sure others have said it. He's also famous for the quote, "True compassion is more than flipping a coin to a beggar. True compassion understands that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring." It's very colorful, vivid language. I like that. His last sermon, given just 24 hours or less before his assassination in April of 1968 in Memphis. We often call it the "I have seen the promised land" speech, and you've probably seen footage of it or at least heard audio tape of it. He addressed the Good Samaritan in that, on that last talk of his. He reminded the audience that the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10 begins with Jesus saying that a crime occurred. Somebody was mugged, basically, before we had that word, on the road that led from Jerusalem to Jericho. Martin Luther King could speak with some authority about the details of that story because he had recently visited the Holy Land, had visited and walked along the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. And one of the things he said that night in April of 1968 was, the road from Jerusalem to Jericho is a meandering, wandering road, quite conducive for ambushing. Direct quote there. As the story goes along, naturally, Martin Luther King, as a Baptist minister, has words of praise for the Samaritan, for his compassion. He practiced charity. But he also was reaching for a deeper analysis. Martin Luther King gave the insight that it would be better to deal, quoting him now, with the causal root of the ambushes, rather than simply patching up the wounds and leaving it that way. The Good Samaritan did patch up the wounds and actually did considerably more for that victim of violence. And yet, Martin Luther King called for a fuller response, a response that we today would call social justice. He called for a Jerusalem Road Improvement Society. People would band together and, again, not just wait for a victim, but to prevent victimhood by perhaps, I don't know, I was thinking of installing lights. Do they have torches back then? We have electric lights today. Or probably more to the point, having a patrol that would patrol that road on a regular basis, at least to deter attacks, if not to catch them in the act. Preventing victimization in the first place. A wonderful theme, a vivid story from Martin Luther King. You all may have heard the famous parable of the river. I'll give you the shortest possible version. It appears in many places. Ronald Rolheiser, in his 1999 book called The Holy Longing, gives one version of it. But the short version is this. There's a group of people who live on a riverfront town that's just downstream from a bend in the river. They can't see what's around the bend, at least not easily. And one day, dead bodies started washing up on the shore. Oh, they weren't all dead. Some of them were still alive. And so they patched up the wounds of these people and they tried to heal them. And if somebody was ill, they treated them. But the dead bodies, of course, being good people, they gave them a dignified burial. The problem with the story is the people of the town should be commended for their good work, but they left something out. Why not investigate what's going on around that bend? Take a canoe upstream. Find out why bodies are floating down their river. The point is to pay attention to what is upriver. What is causing this victimhood? And if we can do something about it through social justice, we should prevent victimhood in as much as we can. Let me tell one more story here. And this is a story, I don't know all the details of the story. I've got in dribs and drabs, second and third hand, from my Jesuit confreres who knew Horace Mckenna before his death in 1982. I was still in college in 1982, not yet in the Jesuits. He was a very beloved Maryland province Jesuit who spent the last few decades of his life working at St. Aloysius Gonzaga, a parish about North Capitol and I Street, about a quarter mile from the Capitol Hill. You could actually look down North Capitol and see the dome of the United States Capitol off in the distance. Horace Mckenna's assignment was to run the St. Vincent de Paul Society of that parish, which, as you know, hopefully people are familiar with, there's 300,000 of them around the world, mostly related to parishes, giving out goods to people who are in need. If you're in need, if they're hungry, we'll give you some fruits and vegetables, hopefully healthy foods. If you need bus fare someplace, we'll scrape together the quarters, dollars, and get you a bus fare. If you need shelter for the night, many of these St. Vincent de Paul societies, as does the one in Washington, St. Aloysius Gonzaga, runs a shelter. For decades, that's what Horace Mckenna did, and he was beloved. He was, he's nearly sainted, at least in the imaginations of people in Washington these days. And I only knew him from secondhand stories. There came a day, and I think it was in the 60s, about 20 years before his death, when Horace Mckenna grew frustrated. He had seen the lines of people lining up outside his shelter, outside the food bank and the clothing bank that he ran there, and wondering, why is it getting longer and longer, these lines? Our country's doing pretty well, prosperous decades, but it's not trickling down to these people in need. And I might add, mostly African Americans in our nation's capital, people with lots of discrimination that prevented them from educational attainments and, of course, job market attainments. Horace Mckenna got the idea, and I don't know how it happened. I could kind of imagine him going out that front door of the church. It's actually under the undercroft of the church, and maybe out there smoking a cigarette or something, looking around one night and seeing the dome of the Capitol off in the distance. It's not all that far, it's about 8 blocks. And maybe a light went off in his head and said, I could get up tomorrow morning early, walk down there to the Capitol, and maybe talk to some of the members of Congress, and maybe get, a jobs program, some kind of funding for education, or some kind of outreach, something to end the need of these people, very good and hardworking people, but people unable to finish degrees and get jobs and enter the job market, at least in a smooth way. So that's the Horace Mckenna story. I tell it because it's an example of someone, at least I know him by stories, a Jesuit not too far away and not too long ago, who made a transition himself in his personal life from a charity alone orientation, run St. Vincent de Paul Society, give out the food, to a charity plus justice orientation. And he did. He was famous for really buttonholing, annoying members of Congress to do something about Washington. And by the way, if you know Washington, D.C. politics, you know that I've only told a half truth, because Washington, D.C. has how many representatives in Congress? Oh, 0, I forget. So that was the problem. He couldn't buttonhole his own rep because there was no rep. He had to get other people, and there's a committee, it's called the Capital Committee, or the Capital City Committee, to change and to open up things, at least locally, for the people. And he made a difference, and he's greatly revered for that. Can I mention one more Jesuit before I move into the middle of the talk? I could not possibly do this talk without mentioning, I believe still, the most recently canonized saint who had an S.J. after his name, Saint Alberto Hurtado, who was a Chilean Jesuit. He died in 1952, very famous in Chile and beyond for starting a program called Hogar de Cristo, which works directly with the poor. And most of his life, again, was like Horace Mckenna, working directly with people in need. And yet, he also included charity as well as social justice, advocacy, some of it political advocacy, some of it urging corporations to hire people who might not have a very good job, resume, record to look at. He did amazing things on the advocacy level as well as the charity level. Charity plus justice. And his famous quote, this is worth repeating, I'm going to say it twice. St. Alberto Hurtado is most famous for this sentence. Injustice causes more wounds in society than charity alone can heal. Don't you love that? Injustice causes more wounds than charity alone can heal. I want to drag you through a couple of Catholic social teaching documents, just a couple of lines each, but I want to document from our church's very rich heritage of social teachings some of the things I've been talking about regarding charity and justice. The clearest place where this distinction is brought up, and I might say it's somewhat resolved there if you read carefully, is in 1931, the encyclical of Pope Pius XI called Quadragesimo Anno, in which, very simply, is in paragraph 77, the Pope says this: there are two things required for progress on the social question of how people are doing and how poverty is. And he lists two things: the reform of institutions and the correction of morals. Pretty good list. The correction of morals would make us more generous, produce more virtues like charity. That's the charity end. But the reform of institutions, well, there's your social justice end of the spectrum. It would change those economic structures, the political structures, give the poor a chance not to be victimized in the first place. This would be an excellent two-track solution recommended by a pope. You can't quote any authority higher than that. So it's a both and. It's not an either or. And that theme of both charity and justice runs through all Catholic social teaching documents, from popes and bishops and councils of bishops, the Second Vatican Council, ever since those decades of the early 20th century. Allow me to cite just one or two more documents. In 1971, the Synod of Bishops met in Rome, and they wrote a document, and one of the most famous quotes from that document, I'll read you the full paragraph, is paragraph 6 of their document, Justice in the World, written by over 200 bishops from around the world. And it runs like this: action on behalf of justice and participation in the transformation of the world fully appears to us as a constitutive dimension of the preaching of the gospel, of the Church's mission for the redemption of the human race and its liberation from every oppressive situation. It's a bit of a mouthful, but you heard the key words there. And one of those key words is constitutive. If the preaching of justice, if action on behalf of justice is a constitutive dimension of the gospel, it is an essential dimension of the gospel. It is not optional. It is not something you can say, well, this week I feel like doing social justice. Other weeks, not so much. It's a constitutive dimension. It's part of our faith. In Jesuit documents of that same era, I'm thinking of the 1970s, you see more and more mentions of phrases like the faith that does justice, or phrases like the service of faith and the promotion of justice. Those are documents from my own order, the Society of Jesus. But many Catholic groupings of bishops and of religious orders around the world emphasized during those years, the 60s, the 70s, and really up till today, it's more than just rhetoric. If you're not working for justice, you're not practicing fully the gospel. One last little dip into church documents. The issue of charity and justice continues to be with us here now in this new millennium. People are still talking about this. People are still parsing church documents. I'm going to mention two recent papal encyclicals in a moment, looking for the relationship between charity and justice. What can we learn? What can we rule out? What are we forced to rule in? I'm referring to the first and the third encyclicals produced by our current pontiff, Benedict XVI. I'm going to be talking about his first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, in the year 2006, and his most recent encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, in 2009. It was released July 7th of 2009. Both deal a great amount with the issue of charity and justice. Okay? In fact, the word charity is in the titles of both of them. There was concern after the first of these two encyclicals, Deus Caritas Est, because some of the phrasing that Pope Benedict chose, I'm thinking of paragraphs 20 through paragraph 32, so highly praised charity, maybe as an abstraction, as a general virtue, that some people were concerned that maybe the message of justice, social justice, which had appeared in all the previous papal encyclicals in a positive way, that maybe it was being eclipsed or even sidelined. I say some people said this because I was one of them. I was a little bit concerned that we were perhaps losing the sense of social justice. In a March 13th, 2006 issue of America magazine, with Benedict on the cover, I participated in a 4-part symposium of articles trying to analyze Deus Caritas Est, weighing in on what it meant from a theological perspective regarding the issues, the relationship between charity and justice. By the way, my short article was called Don't Forget Justice. Okay? I was a little concerned that Benedict may have been doing that. However, my concern, I think, was vindicated or overcome, whatever the phrase is, by the most recent papal encyclical. It's fully a social encyclical. It deals with those issues that the previous social encyclicals, and I've quoted some already in this talk, dealt with. The condition of workers, international justice, trade around the world, how people are doing, the dignity of life, the whole range of social issues that we're concerned about when we as people of faith turn to the topic of social justice. So, like myself, many social justice enthusiasts felt vindicated by Caritas in Veritate when it came out last summer. It called for the reform of structures like international trade. It called for a re-examination of the way investment is made. It called for authentic human development. And by the way, Benedict chose that phrase carefully because that phrase, authentic human development, played a major role in Paul VI's social encyclical, 1967, Populorum Progressio. And this most recent encyclical was intended as a 40th anniversary encyclical. It was delayed, so it came out 42 years later. But there's Benedict is calling attention, much to his credit, of a line of development concerning authentic human development, that theme. And so, again, it's more than simply charity, although nowhere would Benedict ever say anything negative about charity, but he insists that we act with an eye towards social justice. Mere generosity is not going to solve problems like imbalances in international trade. Generosity is extremely good, and you can't do without it. But we as Christians need to be hard-headed to plan and to practice social justice in a very firm way. I haven't talked yet about spirituality. But behind all of these documents, behind the stories I think I told about Martin Luther King and Horace McKenna and Alberto Hurtado, I believe is a spirituality of social transformation, making the world a better place, taking injustices and transforming them into something better. Naturally, people have different visions of the end point. Is it egalitarianism, where everyone has the same amount of property? Probably not. But it should be a protection of the poor. And our spirituality as Christians should lead us to make efforts along those lines. Why would a church, which of course is interested in eternal salvation, why would a church like ours be so concerned about people's poverty and wealth, about their bodies, about their material conditions? And I think the answer is fairly simple. Because our founder, Jesus, cared about people's bodies. And if they were hungry, he fed them. And if they needed healing, he took care of their medical needs miraculously. He spoke a great deal about those who are outcast in society. And today, that is the poor. Whether it's monetary poverty or other kinds of marginalization and poverty, Jesus cared for people. They have bodies as well as souls, those people out there and in here too. And our concern for people has to include material concern. These themes actually reflect very well a theological point, which is that our Christian faith is both immanent and transcendent. The transcendent side pertaining to perhaps the next life, our destiny with God, supernatural issues and spiritual health. Never to be demeaned, but to be completed by concern for our bodies, our material reality. Ours is an incarnational faith, especially our Catholic Christian faith. God takes seriously the material world. God acts in all of the sacraments I can think of in ways that are physical, a word, an anointing, bread and wine, and any number of other ways, a touch, that healing, both bodily and physical, is carried out. We're called to balance inner worldly and otherworldly concerns. If our faith is too privatized, if it's just a matter of spiritual realities, we may be doing some good work, we may be fulfilling some of the Christian mission, but we're not doing all of it. Our faith lacks its fullness. Now, of course, there's always the danger of going too far, actually in either direction, right? We can over-spiritualize the gospel and pay no attention to people's physical, material well-being, ignore poverty, or just spiritualize it away. That's one direction we can go. The other extreme would be also very bad, perhaps equally bad, which is to reduce people's well-being, maybe their salvation, to material outcomes. And if people that they're getting richer, therefore they're saved. I don't think that either one of those positions, those extreme positions, are at all defensible. And anybody who would say that they are, that's a problem. We have to talk about this. I think our faith holds us to a higher standard, to fall to neither extreme, to hold in a dynamic, creative tension our hope that lies in history and our hope that lies beyond history. And so we're called to care about all of the marks of progress, spiritual as well as physical. The kingdom of God is not exhausted by material progress, but it's not completely distinct from material progress. If we don't care about the poverty that we see, then we're really not practicing the fullness of faith. What then may we expect here? I believe that our church is full of a great diversity, and it's a wonderful quality. Diversity of people with a diversity of opinions, and I think we're at our best when we're sharing and trading opinions. We do require some unity. I think we do require that people hold up both the bodily and the spiritual health of people as goals, but it never surprises me when people are, as they naturally are, somewhat more enthusiastic for one side of the spectrum as opposed to the other. You all know people who, maybe they have their head in their clouds. They're really into the spiritual health of people, and when it comes time to think about poverty or world problems like that, they think of a charitable response, of generosity, of virtue, of personal holiness, and they're good people. You may know other people who are at the other end of the spectrum. Maybe they're liberation theologians. Maybe they want to get out there and preach against over-spiritualizing the gospel, and they want to be on the front lines, and maybe sometimes they err, and they forget what theologians call the eschatological reservation, which is the notion that really, in the fullness of time only, is our destiny. Material progress is good, but it doesn't exhaust our faith. I think everyone can see that the extremes are not healthy, and that we're called to live in that middle ground where we affirm both charity and justice. And by the way, when I talk about this, people usually ask me, well, who does this, who does that? So I usually play the stereotype. So here's the stereotype. There are a couple of Franciscans in the room. Usually the Franciscans are held up as the paragon of charity, and they're out there in the front lines, as St. Francis was, their founder. And so they're extremely commendable, practicing charity at that end of the spectrum. Or at least that's what occupies their time and their energy. On the other side would be, me, or someone like me, with an SJ after his name. And we're usually caricatured or stereotyped as the people that, their heads in the clouds and they're locked away in a library someplace, or maybe they're advocating, walking around the halls of Congress. This has actually happened in history. And that we may lose track with direct contact with the poor, which, by the way, is an occupational hazard of being a theologian or a Jesuit or anybody who's maybe on the more scholarly end of things. By the way, these stereotypes do not hold strictly true. I know plenty of very scholarly Franciscans who do work for justice and advocacy, etc., have a more of a structural, institutional approach, and I know plenty of Jesuits who are on the very front lines of working for charitable works as well as social justice, really on the street. So don't give in to the stereotypes too easily. My personal recommendation is that all of us are called to exhibit a balance in our lives. And if you spend too many hours, locked away without any contact with the poor, and you're not doing anything for direct service, re-examine that. And on the other side, if all of your work, you're just pouring yourself out on the street, giving away things and practicing direct charity, think about the obligation to do something that might be more long-term, efforts that might have legs that reach to the next generation. Both are good activities. Neither one is complete. So here's where I relax the tension. I think I've already relaxed the tension between charity and justice, but let me just say a few more explicit things about the spectrum between charity and justice. First of all, charity and justice come from the same motivation. They're not alien from each other. We care about the well-being, physical and spiritual, of people that we run into, people that we see, people that we serve. And by the way, those we don't see, those who are distant from us. We have concern for the people in Haiti who suffered so horribly from that earthquake, and Chile and Taiwan and other places around the globe. Natural disasters really bring out the best in us. reaching out beyond the borders, beyond our small circle, coterie and cocoon of friends. There's no need to choose between charity and justice because in a sense, if you take the long view, justice is merely kind of a routinized version of charity. I care about somebody, I will do anything to help them, the people in need. What does it take to help them? And sometimes that's indirect action. It's just a longer haul version of charity. And justice work is what makes charity more sustainable. So I want to break down those distinctions. A theologian years ago said that love travels best through the well-worn grooves that we call institutions. Charity, love, if you really want it to travel, you've got to work on reforming the institutions that our social complex depends upon. Maybe that's world trade. Maybe that's the political system or the legal system. Love travels best through those well-worn grooves we call institutions. Charity and justice build on each other. They need each other. Without love, justice is kind of cold, maybe even harsh. It's just the minimum. Without justice, love can become sentimental, kind of sloppy, not as effective. These two, love and justice, charity and justice, complement each other. They don't compete. From moment to moment, we may have to choose one or the other. Do I spend time in the library looking up poverty rates and making a case to my senator, or do I go out there and work at the Pine Street Inn? You can't do both at the same time, probably, but hopefully you have time for both at some point in your life, in your day. Neither one in isolation is enough to meet human needs. And admittedly, sometimes people make these false distinctions between them. And I suspect the commentator I started with, Glenn Beck, was thinking of a very sharp distinction where social justice had nothing to do with the charity, which I'm sure he would embrace, but he didn't see that these two concepts can be related, okay? I want to give you an example. Perhaps the best example I know of a work, of an agency that combines charity and justice. The JRS, the Jesuit Refugee Service. This is a Jesuit-started agency. It started back in the 70s that works in dozens of countries around the world, and it works very often in refugee camps, but it also lobbies members of government in places around the world. The self-understanding of the Jesuit Refugee Service is threefold. Number one, accompaniment, working closely with refugees. Number two, service, providing life-saving aid in emergencies, especially in refugee camps. And three, advocacy, attempting to change structures, walking the corridors of power, making the institutions better. Accompaniment, service, advocacy. The more you know about the JRS, and I've learned a lot about it from some of the students who come to the school to write theses about the topic. Currently there are some students working on the topic of understanding JRS better. They will give us, understanding this threefold mission, breaks down the distinction between justice and charity just a little bit. Long-term and short-term concerns. In the popular imagination, it's more heroic to practice direct charity. Think of Mother Teresa. She won the renown of the world. I remember when she died in 1997. People around the world were grieving, and rightly so. And she deserved to be remembered so fondly. She was extraordinary. People who work for justice don't have the photo ops that Mother Teresa had. They're hunkered down over data. Maybe they're poverty researchers. And so just think about that. In the popular imagination, charity gets more attention because it seems more heroic and extraordinary. One of my favorite quotes, though, this might be the greatest soundbite on this topic, so I'll quote it. You may have heard of the late Archbishop of Recife, Brazil, named Dom Helder Câmara, who famously said, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist." So you have to go with the soundbite there. He was an advocate for justice as well as charity, I might add. And that quote points to the dangers of walking maybe that careful line of asking hard questions, performing social analysis. As I approach the end of this presentation, I'm very aware that I haven't really talked about the content of Catholic social teaching, the usual list of themes about human dignity and common good and subsidiarity and property ownership and the dignity of work, rights of workers, option for the poor, peace and disarmament. Those themes and others are worthy of attention. And by the way, here's the plug for my book on sale outside. I treat all of those topics and more in chapter 5 of my book, Living Justice. Why have I not talked about the content of Catholic social teaching beyond the charity-justice split? Because we agree on these things. Anybody who is in the Catholic Church and subscribes to these ideas, and by the way, plenty of people outside the Catholic Church sign on to this and work with Catholics on this. There's no controversy. There's few disputes about those basic items, maybe how they're interpreted from time to time. But the charity-justice distinction and the relationship between those two does seem to bring out controversy, disputes. I didn't need Glenn Beck to provide my introduction today, but in a sense, I'm glad that he did. Let me close by identifying two lingering questions. I'll give the short version of this that are on the back of my mind. First, regarding justice and charity. Some people have scruples about mixing church and state too closely. And because of those scruples, maybe Glenn Beck was part of this, they're very wary of any time the church speaks on public issues. We call this public theology or being a public church, and I think those are positive words, but some people are afraid of entangling religion and politics, so that church leaders pressuring political leaders and maybe threatening to compromise the religious freedoms that are enshrined in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, the so-called separation of church and state. These people fear violating the spirit or the letter of our Constitution. They fear religious interference in political temporal matters. They fear violating the consciences of people, citizens, who may not want to go along with any given church's teachings. Notice that I've used the word fear 3 or 4 times. Maybe these are legitimate fears, and maybe it's a good reminder, but we shouldn't let fears overcome all of our sense of church mission, etc. I still believe, although we're called to practice vigilance against those fears, those abuses, we are called, I think very firmly, to practice social justice and not to be shy about speaking in public from our Catholic faith. That's the first of my 2 lingering questions. The second one is about the issue of mandated charity, so-called, and the theological status when we're almost forced to do good things. What am I thinking about? I'm thinking about the IRS, the tax system, the welfare state. And the United States, by the way, has one of the smallest, least generous, most stingy welfare states in the industrialized, developed world. Should a Christian support welfare state programs to help the poor? Is paying taxes, which go to the relief of poverty, is it in any way meritorious, since after all, we're compelled to give this money? Wouldn't it be better to cancel all those programs, AFDC or TANF and food stamps and housing assistance, and just rely exclusively on benevolence, on charity, on the kindness of people's hearts? Why do we comply? Is there any merit in complying with the IRS and these tax-funded assistance that our tax dollars go for? There are plenty of people who think that would be the way to go. Just cancel all the programs. There's no merit to them. Father Robert Sirico, a fellow priest of mine, who helps run the Acton Institute in Grand Rapids, Michigan, claims that such programs simply backfire. They crowd out genuine charity, and they confuse compulsion with generosity. If we have an obligation to the poor at all, that's no way to fulfill the duty such arguments run. And there may be some points on which Sirico, the Acton Institute, the libertarians, people at that end of the spectrum, have some points, and we should re-examine the spirit of generosity and what it means. But I would also like to make the point that our system protecting the poor is an act of social justice. And if the poor in our country, and I'm uncomfortable even using the word the poor as such a pigeonhole, but for shorthand, if low-income people in our country relied upon charity and the occasional help that they might get from generous strangers, many people, many millions more people would go homeless and hungry and have other problems in our country. It really ties into an entire debate, which we don't have time to go into, regarding dependency. Every time you pass a beggar in Harvard Square or any square in Boston or any other city, the dilemma of giving. probably arises in your hearts. It certainly does in mine. Giving alms is an ambiguous act. We're never sure whether that act will lead to where it's intended to help people keep body and soul together. I have no clear answers here, but I want to call attention to the challenge, and I want to call attention to the possibility that the goal of giving alms is to transform the giver as much as it is to help the recipient of those things. That's going to be a question that stays with us just about forever. So I return to where I started. Charity, social justice. Both and. That's the message of our church. We need both. Real social change, real improvement in society, real progress, especially against poverty, requires both a change of heart, so charity, greater generosity, and it requires a change of structures, working through social justice channels for better structures. To ignore either one of these is, frankly, unchristian. It's not practicing the fullness of faith. And we don't do these things because they're easy. In fact, I think we do them precisely because they're hard. They're required. Life would certainly be easier if we could just shut out the people in need and live in maybe a suburban cocoon where we don't run into people, limit our circle of concern. But John Paul II, among all of the popes, issued very strong words urging us to take action and to see the poor not as some irksome source of demands on us. That's a papal word, irksome. I didn't create that. You don't hear popes use the word irksome very often. But rather to see the poor as in solidarity with us, as our true neighbors, to have fellow feeling, not just superficially, but really deep and abiding commitment to the well-being of people all around the world. I keep coming back, by the way, to that story from the 4th century Rome, when St. Lawrence, a deacon in the church in Rome, was called by the Roman authorities, the emperor or his minions, to empty the treasury of the church and bring out the riches of the church and give it to the government. And St. Lawrence didn't go into the treasury room of the church, or if they even had one back then. What did he do? He led a procession of the poorest, low-income members of his congregation and walked them right into the government official's office and said, "These are the treasures of our church." St. Lawrence. Mother Teresa, in a similar way, saw the poor, the outcast that she ministered to, as the treasures of the world. And she also gave us one of the greatest sound bites, which is, God does not demand that we be successful, but that we only be faithful. So even if our efforts for social justice backfire, they don't work the way we want to, we are, by doing them, are being faithful, by combining justice and charity. What's my summary? My summary is, relax. We've been on the right track, Catholic social teaching, for the last 120 or so years. That's not a reason to get very proud and to rest on our laurels. We need to continue to do the work that we are called to do. We are called to combine faith and justice. We are called to not to grow complacent. Glenn Beck will probably not be the last person ever to challenge our church's prophetic stance that holds together faith and justice, a hard thing to do. Our church that seeks social change. Plenty of people want us not to fight poverty. There's a lot of vested interest in keeping the system, the status quo, just the way it is. The question is, does our church still have a mission to social justice today? My answer is yes. It certainly does. And it helps us a great deal to focus on two things: what the church does directly and what it inspires other people to do. And so think of all the things the church does: producing documents, running programs, and hopefully inspiring people around the world, even if they don't share our faith, to follow through on some of the things. And my closing word is about a lay-centered spirituality. If the work of justice will proceed, if social justice is going to occur, it's going to rely upon the vast bulk of people in the church, the laity, who are on the front lines already, who are in the workplaces, who are on the streets, who are in the corridors of power. They are the ones who will be there when social justice issues arise in legislatures, in workplaces, etc. So we do have much work to do to make this world a more human and humane place, but we also have a great treasury of resources that we can draw from in the social teachings of our church. So thank you very much.